So I say weaknesses and I say vulnerabilities, but weakness is something that may or may not cause a potential to be a risk that actually affects, that actually becomes evident. Vulnerability, and this is, I'll take these words from like Bob Martin or someone who's worked in the assurance space for common weakness enumeration and pieces like that, and then I'll tell you my spin on it. So vulnerability is actually something you have to deal with because it will express itself. A weakness to him is a potential. It may or may not be an actual vulnerability in your code that may be exercised. And those are true. If I look at a piece of code and I find that you have a little buffer overflow somewhere and it's overflowing a buffer that's on the heap and stuff next to it doesn't matter, then I don't really care because it won't really hurt you. But that's a weakness to them. But something that actually might be a stack smash that might actually evidence control, that you can actually jump around in memory and execute other code, well, that might be more of a vulnerability to them. I take it a step further. One of the ways that we measure in the space I work is there are vulnerabilities. There are these pieces that you enumerate up. But at some point, you have to make some judgment on whether that's actually going to affect the mission of what you do. And that's a risk. So weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and risks. Risk is something that actually you factor in the other pieces. For example, I may have protections somewhere else that prevent the exercise of that exploit, like a proxy server that's filtering long input statements, and I have a buffer overflow. Well, that buffer overflow, as long as the proxy server is working, I'm protected. So maybe together, as a holistic sort of point of view, it's not a big risk. I can mitigate this another way. All right, I sort of hinted about the threats, but spend more time on this. Early part was about how this is all linked together. Okay. I remember the first internet worm. That was the first big event. And it was so unsophisticated, and the tools to do such things were not really available. You had to be really good, and you had to know your target systems real well, and you had to really understand and have access to source code. In the late 80s, I was working at Bell Labs, and well, of course we had the source code. We invented Unix, and we had that available. It makes you a better programmer to see examples. What you have today is what I had with the people that I work with. But everyone has access to source code today. There's open source projects that are great examples of how to build things. Application web servers, native pieces that talk over the network wire, things that send UDP packets or TCP packets, or how to craft tunneling over ICMP to get past a firewall. Great examples out there. The tools purpose-built to attack and cause harm to systems, well, those have grown in sophistication also. So the more that the top pyramid of the people who are really clever build tools that show or example how to do some of these things, well, the more people who aren't as skilled can use those tools. So it's a raising of the bar. It's the normal way that things happen. You build upon things that build upon things, and you can get farther because of the stuff you leverage. So the sophistication of the attack today is different. And remember when I told you that there's people that broke into financial systems and they were sitting right next to banking statements or financial information, and they didn't know it. Well, the people who actually want to leverage that sort of thing have been paying attention also for the last decade, and they know it. And over time, the attacks are getting more serious. And you might not see these in your average run-of-the-mill sort of company, but for critical infrastructure, financial services, things that make a difference, these tend to see more sophisticated attacks over time. Attacks you might not see. Malware that gets right past the signature, the antivirus signatures that you have because, well, it's just signature based, and it's a list of signatures. If we sat down today and took half an hour, literally half an hour, to write a little piece of malware that delivers itself over email, none of the antivirus of the people that you send it to will ever trigger. It's the wrong signature. So our threats are getting pretty sophisticated over time. But where I work, again, it's real simple, right? I have suppliers who make software for me. And these are defense contractors. And on the government side, we say, hey, we'd like you to build this. And please build that. And we try to make sure, as best as possible, we specify what it is you're building. We try to talk to you about, we need to do this, we need to be this fast, process this many messages per second. And a lot of our stuff is very much measurable. Radio frequencies or bandwidth or processing frames per second for video. It could be any one of these things. And we try to specify as best we can that when you build software, it needs to be this secure. And we try to make sure we can point to measurables that we can actually a check during the course of running this. But the reality of this relationship is very different than most of the folks. I mean, we know it where I work, but it's really kind of deeper than we thought. Nobody writes every line of code anymore. It makes no sense. So if I were going to write a piece of code that processes images, well, there's lots of image processing libraries out there. And some of them are available freely in open source. Some of them are commercial libraries. Some of them are various licenses that free within quotes or free with actually as in beer. Could be shareware, could be privately run little groups of people that just do their own code chunk and library, make it available on Google Code, or it could be a group of people that actually collaborate, because there are all different kinds of projects out there. And it makes sense to leverage such things. You might build it yourself, but even when you build it yourself, you leverage some kind of libraries. So no code today is ever really sort of done in a vacuum and in a clean room. And I'm sure for some programs, from some special applications needs, they probably do that. Everything from scratch, work in a clean room, all that stuff. But for most of the things we do, we collect and aggregate, we integrate, we build glue code and stitch pieces together. Because a lot of times we're facing the same things you guys are. We have time, cost, and schedule to hit. And my Java media framework's not working, and I think I'm just going to scrap it real fast because I have to hit a deadline, and I'm going to go get this piece of assembly code that does the screenshot, and I'm going to collect the things in a directory and just SCP them over or rsync them. Because you know what? It's got to work. That's a kludge. That's a hack, but it works. So you make design decisions. You make shortcuts. You do what you can to meet the need. And if it doesn't matter, but what I do matter is about affecting that supply chain so that when they do design decisions like that, where they do make implementation choices, that they try to make good decisions about it, so it's not done in a way where it's maybe more insecure. Because honestly, you could do it this way or that way. Actually, I have a problem that could be solved that many ways. Actually, I really want you to figure out how to solve it. I just want to set the goal, and I want the designer and the developers and the engineers to help solve how to get there. I don't want to overly burden them with exactly this is the path I want. Well, then write the code yourself. So we work very hard on telling them what we want them to produce, not how to produce it. But in some cases, when it comes to software, we do want to specify a few things. All right. I'll keep beating this dead horse about threats. So if you buy my story, and you don't, a lot of security is viewed as hand-waving, and maybe we're, Chicken Little. This guy's really not falling, and come on, how likely is something like that to happen? There's a book called Blind Man's Bluff. It's awesome. It's about submarines and submarine warfare in the 1970s. And there's a story in there. And in that story, they talk about the new class of nuclear subs that came out. We had them first, and we were quiet. Perfectly quiet. They couldn't track us. The game of submarine warfare was sonar and listening, and you'd hear them and hear whoosh, 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 just like the old World War II movies. And you'd hear the whoosh, whoosh, whoosh of the blades as they're pushing the little diesel engines through the air. And as soon as you go nuclear, quiet, no engine noise. But what you get is propeller noise, maybe. Depends how you design your propellers, and we were really good at it. We had subs that no one can follow, which meant we could sneak behind them and follow anyone else. We were awesome at it until they came out with nuclear subs. And they had the same things we had. And then in that story, at one point, there seemed to have been this design flaw that somehow creeped into the Russian submarines, where they procured certain chips, and when they was the motor controllers, and one of the props was slightly different in rotation than the other one, just enough that you can hear when they turned, and when the body eclipsed the other one. Now we can follow them. They're moving, they're turning left, they're turning right, they're going straight. The game whole changed because of one mistake on one chip, in one little chunk of code, in a BIOS of a little chip that controlled the motor. You can read other stories too. There's a bunch of other neat stories like this. If you like the kind of spy versus spy kind of games from the Cold War, At the Abyss is another story with examples of how we played games against each other. Well, if that's what we were doing in the 1970s, imagine how much time has progressed and how better we've gotten or they've gotten, and how the competition has happened in normal Darwinian evolution. It's going to be interesting stuff now. But again, like them, we also procure, everyone includes open source.